This video is designed for students in COM 105, Interpersonal Communication, and this particular video will be addressing some topics covered in Chapter 1 of Looking Out, Looking In. So let's begin this chapter with a quick look at why we communicate. If you think about it, human communication is wired within us. You know, the ability to use language to communicate our thoughts and feelings, as well as nonverbal messages. All of this stuff comes to us quite naturally. But when communication scholars break it down, they find that we communicate basically for four different reasons. We have physical needs, and research has shown again and again this necessity for us to communicate and how it connects to living a healthier or happier life. Studies have shown that married couples live longer than unmarried couples. And they also find that people who live longer tend to have more vibrant social networks. So this physical need that we have translates into better health and well-being if we're good at communicating, and we'll talk about communication competence in a little while. A concept that you'll be working with in Chapter 2 is covered in the second bullet there, that sense of identity of who we are and how we manage that identity is driven by our communication skills. We also have social needs when we communicate. And then underneath it all, there's just practical goals of, ordering a meal in a restaurant or conducting a transaction in a store. We use communication at a very practical level. So, this provides some insight into all of the different directions we're going to be going as we read through and work our way through Looking Out, Looking In. So to move on, here's a model of what I call the old version of communication. It's called the linear view, and it's kind of like that old video game of Pong where you have a sender and a receiver, and they're just batting messages back and forth. And in this model, communication is done to a receiver. This really is not the ideal for communication studies, and we'll look at something called the transactional model of communication in a moment. But first, let's define communication. So we looked at why we communicate. Here's a very bookish definition of communication, and you'll notice the first couple of words there. It's a transactional process. Okay, so when we're communicating, there's a transaction going on. And this becomes especially relevant when we look at chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11 in Looking Out, Looking In, because the quality of those transactions drives the quality of our relationship. And these transactions also help us negotiate. And that's not necessarily an explicit negotiation, but it could be a tacit negotiation of how I feel about you and how I feel about our relationship. So we're always communicating, and it's a transaction that we're conducting with other people. That transaction involves participants who occupy different but overlapping environments. So myself, as a 45-year-old male, I have a certain way of seeing the world, for better or for worse. I have a certain set of filters and biases and tendencies that are just driven by my age and gender. And that's not to mention things like, education and family status and whatever other kinds of variables that you could bring in. All of these things inform the environment that I'm in. And when I'm communicating with someone else, they're occupying a unique environment. So our environments are overlapping. And sometimes good things happen when those environments overlap, and sometimes not so good things happen when our environments overlap. And we'll talk more about that as we get into our later chapters. We create relationships through the exchange of messages. And those messages are affected by external noise, physiological noise, or psychological noise. So external noise could just be the rush of cars going by on the street or the hum of the fluorescent lights, right? Physiological noise could be fatigue, distractions, things that are on my mind. I guess that would be psychological noise. So those things that are on my mind, that discussion I had with my spouse before I left for work in the morning. These messages are impacted by a number of forces. So a lot is happening whenever we're communicating with other people, and that's what we're going to be looking at this semester. How these messages are formed, how we exchange them with other people, as well as looking at all of these variables that impact how we communicate and how we understand other people. And here's that transactional model that basically summarizes everything that we just talked about. You have communicators who are in overlapping environments, exchanging messages through a variety of channels, and all of those messages, notice how constant noise is. Again, that physiological, psychological, or external noise that's impacting our message. So this is actually the model that communication scholars use when they look at our communication tendency as human beings. And this is the most current and relevant to everything that we do. Quickly, some principles about communication. Well, communication can be intentional or unintentional. Intentional communication are usually the words that we're saying. Unintentional communication is our nonverbal message. And we're going to break those two components apart when we get to nonverbal communication and talk about this a little bit more. But ultimately, whenever we're communicating, there's a message that we intend to send, and there's the message that the other party actually receives, and they can be quite different. Also, communication is irreversible. There's no taking it back when you say, I take it back. That doesn't happen. We can't unreceive a message, and words and deeds are irretrievable. It's also impossible not to communicate. We are always communicating something, even when we're not speaking, through our nonverbals. That's the most consistent and persistent form of communication that we have. Another communication principle is that communication is unrepeatable. And this is really hard for us to think about, but I'd like, because of our mediated communication style these days, because when we send an email, it's that way forever. But when we're communicating interpersonally, our communication is unrepeatable. Okay, and it's an ongoing process that changes. Remember, I mentioned the difference between intent and the actual message. Well, another way to think about it is when we communicate, there's the words that we're saying, which is the content of our message, and then there's the relational part of our message, that message between the lines that says how I feel about you, or am I in control, or am I dominating, or am I anxious? Our messages consist of two different messages in a sense. There's the content dimension and the relational dimension. So some misconceptions about communication include, it's not always better to communicate. Sometimes no communication is actually better than more communication. Also, we'll talk more about this when we get to language. That is, meanings are not in the words. Meanings rest within the receiver. Meanings are within people. And we attach meaning to these words that we use. And when we receive them from other people, that interpretation sometimes gets us into a lot of trouble. Also, we don't have to be good communicators and share understanding with other peoples, with other people, not peoples. We can be deliberately vague, and again, this is where language becomes problematic. And also, we could equivocate and sacrifice clarity to spare someone else's feelings. Okay? And think about many relationships, and you might have people that you know of in your family. Sometimes they can come from less than perfect understanding. Also, we have to be responsible for our communication. That is, people and events don't cause our reactions. So things like anger or strong emotional reactions, which we'll talk about when we get to chapter 4, um, we have to be responsible for that anger that we express and not necessarily blame someone else for triggering that strong reaction in us. And finally, communication won't solve all of our problems, right? So, we'll talk more about this as we work through chapters, especially 8, 9, and 10. But communication isn't always the answer to what we need. So we're going to take a break in this section, and we'll pick up in these with a few more concepts from chapter 1, which include quantitative versus qualitative communication, as well as competent communication skills and cross-cultural communication.